Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're doing an educational deep dive into Marxist legal theory. We'll be focusing specifically on, well, how to approach studying this complex topic, especially for your exams. Just a note, this material is made available to students by the University of London for educational purposes only. And this deep dive is brought to you by Sinorbit Academy, Sri Lanka. Good luck to all of you who are preparing for exams right now. So our plan today is to explore Karl Marx's foundational ideas, ideology, economy, society, and see how these concepts shape his view of the state and law. We'll also delve into Soviet Marxism, touch upon Western Marxist perspectives, and even look at its relevance to the international economy. Really, our mission is to pull out the key insights to help you navigate this area of jurisprudence effectively for your studies.
Okay, let's unpack this then. When you're getting into Marxist legal theory, the first thing to remember is that Marx offers this really comprehensive way of seeing society. Law isn't just floating free. It's deeply tied into the economy and politics. So as you study, always try to see that bigger picture. Ask yourself, how does this legal idea fit into Marx's whole understanding of society? That's really key.
Absolutely. And to really get Marx, you have to see him as a philosopher responding to other thinkers, particularly Hegel. Marx was actually a jurisprudence scholar himself, but his angle was very specific. He argued that legal and political forms don't just emerge from abstract ideas like the development of the human mind. No, he said they arise from the material conditions of life. That's a fundamental shift in perspective, so keep that right at the front of your mind as you study.
Yes, and this focus on the material conditions of life is crucial. Marx argued they're primary, they come first in shaping our legal and political systems. Think about his famous metaphor, the base and superstructure. The economic structure, which means the relations of production, how society organizes work and ownership, corresponding to the development of its material productive forces, that's the real foundation. That's the base.
Right, the base. And then sitting on top of that base, you have the superstructure. This includes legal systems, political systems, and also forms of social consciousness, like our ideas about morality, religion, philosophy. And the crucial link, the thing to really grasp, is that the mode of production of material life determines the general character of the social, political, and spiritual processes of life. So it isn't our thoughts creating our material world, it's the other way around. Let's just say that key phrase again because it's so important. It's not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being determines their consciousness. Understanding this base superstructure relationship is absolutely vital.
Exactly, and flowing directly from that comes the concept of ideology. For Marx, ideology is basically a worldview, but one that's shaped by your material position in society, especially your class position. And importantly, this worldview often serves to kind of mystify or obscure the real underlying power structures. Think about it. How might a legal concept like equality before the law function ideologically if you have huge economic inequality? Or consider the different worldviews of, say, a peasant versus a landowner back in the day. Their economic status would fundamentally shape how they understand things like rights and justice, wouldn't it?
Right, which leads us to that really powerful quote from Marx, I think it was 1884. Your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into law for all. That really hits home the idea that law, far from being neutral, can actually be an instrument of class power. It directly challenges the usual notions of law's impartiality. And Bankowski and Mungham picked up on this later, suggesting law should be studied as part of an explicitly political theory, showing it up as an instrument of class power that stems right from the economic organization of society.
Now, connecting that to your studies, it's useful to see how Bankowski and Mungham applied Marx. But it's also worth noting that some critics find their view a bit, well, maybe too narrow. The criticism is that it might suggest law is only about economics, perhaps missing other influences on how law develops and works. So it's a valuable lens, but maybe not the only lens. Be aware of that potential reductionism.
Okay, so Marx wasn't just thinking in isolation. He was very much engaging with the big philosophical ideas of his time, and the giant figure there was Hegel. Hegel saw law as part of this grand historical progression, resolving contradictions in society and leading towards the modern state. It was all about the unfolding of reason, this historical social totality.
And what's fascinating is Marx's critical take on Hegel. He acknowledged Hegel's focus on history and social experience, which was important, but he fundamentally disagreed that law's development was driven by some internal logic of ideas. Marx insisted, and here's another key phrase to remember, law is rooted in the conditions of material production. Let's say it again. Rooted in the conditions of material production. That's the core disagreement.
Yeah, and he gives a really concrete example that challenges that purely formal top-down view of law. He says, look, under the patriarchal system, under the caste system, under the feudal and cooperative system, there was a division of labor in the whole of society according to fixed rules. Quote, were these rules established by a legislator? No. Originally born of the conditions of material production, they were raised to the status of laws only much later. Oh. That really highlights his point that the way society is actually organized on the ground often comes first, and formal law catches up later, reflecting those material realities.
And this ties into his critique of Hegel's view of the state, too. Hegel put a lot of emphasis on private property as the foundation of the modern state. But Marx pointed to examples like Roman law, where public power wasn't solely based on private power in the same way. This underlines Marx's argument that the specific form law takes isn't some universal ideal pattern, but it's shaped by very specific historical and material circumstances. So for your studies, make sure you can contrast Hegel's more idealistic view with Marx's firmly materialist perspective on where law comes from and how it develops.
Right. Okay, moving on to Marx's theory of the state itself. He saw the modern state as reflecting a particular historical shift, what he called the emancipation of private property from the community. Basically, property became separate from communal ties, and this led to the state becoming this separate entity. It looks like it's standing above society, but Marx argued it ultimately serves the interests of the property-owning class, the bourgeoisie. That's a key idea from the German ideology to remember when thinking about Marx's view of the state.
Exactly. And what's crucial to grasp for your exams is how this state, controlled by the dominant class, then shapes our common institutions. It gives law what Marx termed a political form, and this creates the illusion, as he put it, that law is based on the will, on free will. But underneath that illusion, Marx argues, the actual content of the law is deeply connected to the economic interests of that ruling class.
And you can see this historically, can't you? As industry and trade grew, leading to the expansion of private property and civil law, new legal forms popped up to manage it. Like you mentioned Amalfi and the development of maritime law when sea trade took off, or how Roman civil law, which was highly developed around property, was revived in Italy and elsewhere as private property relations became more dominant. The core idea to remember is law reflects the needs of the ruling class. Seeing that historical link is really helpful for illustrating the concept.
Definitely. Now let's shift focus slightly to Marx's analysis of law within his major work, Capital. Here, he zooms in on 19th century factory legislation, specifically laws regulating the working day. And what's really interesting here for your studies is how he analyzes the dynamic. He talks about the passion of capital for an unlimited and reckless extension of the working day. This relentless drive for profit. It eventually provoked a societal reaction, leading to control being imposed through law.
Exactly. Technology was advancing, promising more productivity, but initially it just led to this unregulated, brutal extension of working hours because capitalists wanted to maximize surplus value. It was the struggle against this intense exploitation that eventually forced society, using law, to start setting limits, regulating the length of the working day. And we also see how law tries to adapt, doesn't it? As new types of workplaces emerged, the legal definition of a factory, for instance, had to keep being expanded to cover these new realities to keep up with the changes.
Which brings us to Marx's rather, cynical conclusion on the matter. He states, the creation of a normal working day is, therefore, the product of a protracted civil war, more or less dissembled, between the capitalist class and the working class. End quote. So for Marx, improvements like shorter hours weren't gifts from a benevolent legal system. They weren't about the inherent fairness of law itself. Instead, they were the hard-won results of the working class organizing and fighting, using the law as a tool in their struggle against capital. He was deeply skeptical about law achieving genuine social justice on its own, without fundamental changes in economic power, perhaps even revolution. This critical view of law's limitations is really central.
Okay, so that skepticism naturally leads us into the chapter on Soviet Marxism and the law. The Russian Revolution in 1917 was obviously a huge moment, a real attempt to put Marxist ideas into practice on a national scale. Lenin, drawing heavily on Marx, believed that a violent revolution was actually necessary to smash the existing bourgeois state and replace it with a new kind of state, a proletarian state. Remembering this practical attempt, this shift from theory to practice, is important.
Yes, and what's quite interesting for understanding this period is Lenin's somewhat pragmatic view of law during that initial phase of communism, what's often called socialism. He argued that bourgeois law wouldn't just vanish overnight. It would be abolished concerning the means of production, factories, land, etc., becoming common property. But other aspects of bourgeois law, perhaps in areas like contract or even criminal law, might need to stick around for a while, almost as a temporary necessity during the transition.
Then we encounter Evgeny Pleshikanes, a very influential Soviet legal theorist. He developed this idea linking law very tightly to private property and the market, his commodity form theory of law. His argument essentially was that the legal form itself, with its focus on contracts, exchange, and formally equal legal subjects, really reaches its highest point, its most developed form, under bourgeois capitalism. Why? Because capitalism is fundamentally based on a market where everything, including labor power, is treated as a commodity to be bought and sold. Understanding Pleshikanes' commodity form theory is pretty significant.
It is, but Pleshikanes' theory also ran into some serious problems and attracted a lot of criticism. A key issue was his equation of all exchange with capitalist exchange. This led him to conclude that basically all law is inherently bourgeois law. This stance kind of ignored the possibility of developing a distinct socialist legality suited to the new system. And, rather grimly, this conclusion inadvertently helped the Stalinist regime, which used his ideas partly to justify sidelining legal constraints and focusing instead on purely technical administration and regulation by the bureaucracy. So for your exams, you need to be ready to discuss both the insights and the serious limitations of Pleshikanes' approach.
Right. So partly in reaction to the way things developed in the Soviet Union and also reacting against what they saw as the complacency and inequalities of Western capitalism, we get the emergence of Western Marxism. Thinkers within this stream, like Louis Althusser, started asking, is there a different way of reading Marx? They were looking for interpretations that move beyond a simplistic, maybe overly deterministic view of that base superstructure relationship. Understanding this critical reaction helps see how Marxist thought continued to evolve.
Absolutely. And what's really crucial in Althusser's work for your studies is his concept of differential development. He argued that the relationship between the economic base and the superstructure isn't just simple cause and effect. It's not like the base just dictates everything in the superstructure directly. Instead, he saw them developing at different speeds in complex ways, influencing each other back and forth. He even sort of complicated the whole base superstructure distinction itself, talking about a complex conjugation of social being rather than neat separate levels. This adds a significant layer of nuance to the original model.
And building on that, Althusser introduced that really important distinction between ideological state apparatuses, or ISAs, and repressive state apparatuses, or RSAs. RSAs are things like the police, the army. They function mainly through force or the threat of force. But ISAs like law, education, the family, media function primarily through ideology. They work by creating and reproducing ways of thinking, shaping how individuals understand themselves and their place in the world, often operating through consent rather than direct coercion.
Exactly. And Althusser argued that law, as a key ISA, plays this vital role in positioning individuals in various social roles. You're a buyer, you're a seller, you're an employee, an owner, a citizen, and so on. And in doing this, law actually helps construct our very sense of self, our subjectivity, particularly in relation to the means of production. So in this Althusserian view, our identities aren't just naturally given. They are, in a very real sense, made or produced by these material and ideological forces, and law is a major player in that process.
Okay, finally, Marxist thought hasn't just stayed within national borders. It's also been applied to understanding the global economy and international law. This perspective shifts the focus from class struggle within a single country to looking at global governance, the relationships between rich and poor nations, the developed and developing world. You get concepts like the metropole satellite dynamic, or analyses of how the global division of labor can create and sustain inequalities on a worldwide scale.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here for your wider understanding is how concepts from Marxist traditions can offer critical lenses on international relations. Thinkers like Barron looking at unilateral transfers of wealth during colonialism, or Immanuel Wallerstein with his world system story, the idea of the historical expansion of Western power creating a global system with a core, a periphery, and a semi-periphery. These theories provide tools to analyze international economic structures and, crucially, international law, including trade law, looking for underlying power dynamics and historical inequalities. It helps us see global issues through a structural historical lens.
Right. So while the standard story about international trade law often emphasizes creating order, efficiency, mutual benefit, a Marxist perspective might look at the same rules and ask, how
Yeah.
might these perpetuate power imbalances that have roots in colonialism and the post-colonial era? Could they potentially disadvantage developing nations, even while claiming to promote free and fair trade? You look at the persistent challenges developing countries face in forums like the WTO, the struggles over things like the Doha Development Agenda. It certainly raises questions about whether the system is truly neutral or if deeper power dynamics are at play.
Precisely. So, to kind of wrap this all up and bring it back to preparing for your studies and exams, let's highlight those key takeaways. First, really understand Marx's philosophical starting point, his roots in Hegel, but also his fundamental materialist critique. Second, get a solid grasp of the base and superstructure model, but also appreciate the nuances added later by thinkers like Althusser with concepts like differential development and ideological state apparatuses. Third, always recognize the absolute centrality of class and economic relations in Marxist theories of the state and law. Fourth, be aware of the historical attempts to apply these ideas, like in Soviet Marxism, Pashukhanis's commodity form theory, and also the critical responses, such as Western Marxism. And finally, fifth, consider the ongoing relevance of Marxist perspectives for making sense of contemporary global economic patterns and legal issues.
Absolutely. Those are excellent points to focus on. We really encourage you to reflect on all this material. Perhaps go back to the readings suggested by the University of London. And maybe here's a final thought to take away and ponder as you continue your studies. Think about some major contemporary issues, the enormous power wielded by multinational corporations, the stark realities of global wealth inequality, the ongoing debates about justice and fairness in the face of climate change or pandemics. How might the critical lens offered by Marxist legal theory help us analyze and understand these complex challenges today? This isn't just historical theory. It's a set of tools that can still be applied. This deep dive is really just your starting point for engaging more deeply and critically with this influential and often challenging body of thought as you prepare for your exams.